All the Young Dudes, James' Perspective by Stay in Dreams. Chapter 9. First Year, Gravity. Friday, the 5th October 1971. The days following dissolved into a golden haze of pure bliss for James. The boys spent nearly every waking minute huddled together, which suited him just fine. In his estimation, there was simply nothing better in the known universe than having all four marauders packed into the same room, laughing until their ribs ached, plotting utterly ridiculous schemes, and just being a family. Of course, the domestic harmony didn't stop Sirius from constantly concerning James to grumble, with a dramatic pout about how Remus was avoiding him. James, executing a masterclass in theatrical nonchalance, merely adjusted his spectacles and offered a casual shrug. "Yeah, but he's always running off, that one. Are you sure it's something to do with you?" In his heart, James knew that statement was a load of old rubbish. He had definitely noticed the tactical maneuvering. Remus made a deliberate point of starting up a lively conversation with either himself or Peter the second Sirius looked like he was gearing up to bombard the poor bloke with a fresh interrogation. To James, watching them navigate the common room was like witnessing a high-stakes game of chess. Sirius was all about the aggressive opening gambits, trying to force Lupin into a tight corner by sheer willpower, whereas James much preferred a long game strategy, simply leaving the door open and letting Remus wander over on his own bloody terms. Yet, even if the structural foundations between Sirius and Remus were looking a bit shaky, the Marauders managed to coast through Friday Charm's lesson without a single hitch. Flipping miracle, really, and even Peter managed to execute the practical portions without setting his fringe on fire. Professor Flitwick was so over the moon when the entire class mastered the advanced levitation theory ahead of schedule that the tiny wizard happily dismissed them early for lunch, his high-pitched voice ringing with unbridled praise through the corridors. The arrival of the following week brought with it the crown jewel of James's timetable: flying. The microsecond their boots hit the grass, James was instantly in his element, kicking off the turf to dart about the sky, showing off with lazy loops and breathtakingly sharp turns, while the rest of the first years were still hovering cautiously close to the ground, like a flock of disoriented pigeons. Madame Hooch's standard warm-up exercises felt like child's play to him. Flipping heck, James thought, with a grin as he cut through a cloud. I was pulling off tighter Wronski finds than this before I even had my first teeth. Sirius was brilliant as well, naturally, handling his broom with that arrogant grace that made all the girls in the stands lean forward, and a good majority of the other pure-blood kids had grown up practically living on broomsticks in their back gardens. Even Peter could hold his own well enough to avoid a diplomatic incident. The Muggle-borns, however, were a different story, and Remus was the worst of the lot. The pack had figured out within 20 minutes of the first lesson that Moony was utterly terrified of heights, so it came as a shock to no one that the poor bloke looked distinctly green around the gills as they dragged themselves into the changing rooms. James tied his scarlet flying kit and laced up the thick leather boots, casting a sympathetic look at his mate's pale face. Out on the pitch, the terrain was a proper swampy mess from the torrential downpour the previous night, the thick mud squelching aggressively underfoot as the class hoisted their designated brooms and waited for Hooch to bark out instructions. James shot a disgusted glance at the school's twig-bare estate brooms, a wave of profound homesickness washing over him. Marilyn, I miss her, James thought miserably, his heart aching for the flawless counter and smooth handling of his beloved Nimbus 1001, resting safely back at Potter Manor. It was a proper tragedy that he had to ride a glorified twig when he was capable of absolute magic in the air, and he made a firm mental note to never pass up an opportunity to tell anyone who would listen just how vastly superior his own racing broom was to the splintered lot they were forced to use now. "Right, mount your brooms, please, ladies and gentlemen," Madame Hooch bellowed, her hawk-like voice cutting cleanly through the blustery wind. "Nice strong breeze today, so I want you all to take good care. Potter, no showing off." This last cautionary jab only caused James's grin to stretch even wider across his face. "As if I could help it," he thought, his chest swelling with effortless confidence. He literally lived for this sort of notice. As the first years clambered onto their designated shafts, James's sharp eyes couldn't help but track Remus. The poor lad's knuckles were already turning a bloodless white as he gripped his splintered school broomstick like a drowning man clutching a life raft. "I'd like 5 laps around the pitch, then a good landing back here from each of you," Hooch instructed, gesturing toward the sodden turf. "Mind the puddle and remember to lean into the wind where possible. Use it to your advantage. 5 points to whoever's back first." With barely a fraction of a warning, the silver whistle was at her lips, and she blew a piercing blast. James didn't waste a millisecond. He nicked off the ground with explosive power, he and Sirius shooting into the grey sky like twin rockets, immediately leaving the rest on the blooming class in a wake of dislodged twigs. The violent rush of the cold autumn wind tearing through the chaotic hair and the familiar surge of adrenaline pumping hot through his veins was a sensation like nothing else on earth. James was grinning so wide his jaw actually ached from the sheer velocity. "You'll never beat me back," he called out dramatically over his shoulder, the thrill of the chase making him feel bulletproof. "Oi, Potter, no showing off," Sirius shouted back over the roar of the wind, his bark of laughter echoing across the empty stadium. Down on the grass below, Madame Hooch was already booming through her magical magnified megaphone, aggressively urging a hovering Remus to fly higher than a measly 10 feet. James risked a quick glance back over his shoulder and noted that Lupin had already fallen disastrously behind the pack, clinging to the wood for dear life with a facial expression that suggested he might violently lose his breakfast at any given moment. "Poor old bloke," James thought with a wave of protective sympathy. Still, he reasoned, as long as Lupin kept his grip and stayed on the bloody broom, no real harm could come to him. James pulled ahead of the competition with fluid ease, his aerodynamic turns leaving Sirius in the dust. By the conclusion of the first lap, the logistical reality of the race was blindingly obvious. James was going to win by a country mile. He was infinitely better at precision maneuvering than Black, who was always about reckless speed rather than actual tactical flight control. By the time James was wrapping up his second circuit, the rest of the miserable class was only just crossing the line to finish their first. Feeling cocky and unchallenged, James intentionally veered off the standard track, steering his broom toward the high wooden towers of the empty spectator stands. He ignored Madame Hooch's irritated admonishments echoing from the pitch. Honestly, James thought with a mental roll of his eyes, how on earth am I supposed to improve my international game if I don't push the limits and challenge my own boundaries? He demolished the remaining 4 laps in no time at all, even with his little theatrical detours and tight waves around the high wooden pillars. Glancing down across the sky, he was slightly surprised to see Sirius slowing his pace, abandoning the race to glide protectively next to a struggling Remus instead. James raised a skeptical brow, a tiny prick of disappointment hitting his chest. Giving up a race just to babysit. he thought, though he quickly shrugged the feeling off. There would be plenty of time for proper competitive races later in the week. For now, he was content to execute a few more lazy circles around the towers, waiting for his mates to catch up. As the lagging duo neared the final stretch, James could hear Sirius and Remus bickering over the whistle of the wind. Their voices grew rapidly louder, escalating into a proper row as they approached the designated landing zone. Except they were coming in far too fast, completely misjudging the descent vector. Before James could even shout a warning from his high perch, the worst occurred. The next thing James knew, the two of them were taggling limbs, losing control as they tumbled toward the earth. Their school brooms went flying out from underneath them like loose twigs as the two marauders crash-landed directly into the center of the swampy puddle. They went skidding and rolling forward across the turf in a blur of limbs, drenching their pristine scarlet robes in filthy brown sludge. "Black! Lupin!" Madame Hooch marched right over to the edge of the swampy disaster zone, her hands planted firmly on her hips. Her reprimanding expression was doing a poor job of hiding the sheer amusement dancing in her yellow eyes. The rest of the gathering Gryffindors eagerly crowded around the perimeter, pointing and giggling hysterically at the state of the duo. James smoothly descended from his high perch, hovering just a few feet off the grass. Though he was shaking so violently with laughter, he could barely keep his balance on his broom handle. Sirius, demonstrating an absurd amount of theatrical dignity, leapt to his feet with all the unshakable grace of his aristocratic pureblood upbringing. He aggressively shook a massive clump of mud from his sleeve before extending a hand to pull a miserable Remus out of the muck. The two of them stood there in the grey light, blinking heavy water droplets out of their eyes, like a pair of waterlogged kittens. "What did I say about minding the puddle?" Madame Hooch raised a skeptical eyebrow, but the stern lecture quickly collapsed into a knowing smirk. "A point each from Gryffindor. You'd better go and wash off in the showers. Off you go." The damp duo turned on their heels and trudged toward the Quidditch changing rooms, comically holding the dripping fabric of their waterlogged robes well away from their legs. James took off his wire-rimmed spectacles, using the dry hem of his inner jersey to wipe away the tears of laughter streaming down his face. "I'd pay 50 galleons to have a camera right now," he thought, delighted. Just as Madame Hooch was about to look up and spot him hovering, James kicked off the turf, darting away toward the high wooden spectators' towers once more. He unleashed a triumphant whoop that echoed across the grounds as he began tightly circling the grandstands. The adrenaline was still buzzing far too beautifully in his veins. He simply wasn't ready to come down to the boring old ground just yet. "You think you're something special, don't you?" Suddenly, a brilliant flash of vibrant scarlet material cut directly through the grey sky, right in front of his trajectory. James's reflexes kicked in instantly. He yanked back on his handle, braking sharply to avoid a head-on aerial collision. Chucking his broom into a stable hover, he hurriedly pushed his chaotic dog fringe out of his eyes and found himself staring into a pair of shockingly bright, fiercely intelligent green eyes. "Evans?" James blinked, taken aback, as his brain momentarily stalled. Since when did she fly like that? He thought, an unexpected spike of captivation hitting his chest. "What are you doing up here?" "Telling you to stop acting like a lunatic," Lily replied smoothly, her broom control effortless as she eyed his wild flying. Madame Hooch wants you down on the ground. James, still off guard but amused by the gorgeous apparition blocking his flight path, let a signature grin take over his face. He leaned back against the wood, his brown eyes sparkling. "Well, Evans, I've been known to turn a few heads in my time. To illustrate his point, James expertly twisted his weight, shifting his center of gravity until he was hanging upside down from his broom handle right in front of her, gravity defying his hair as he flashed her an unbothered grin. Lily rolled her eyes with an air of long-suffering tolerance. "You're ridiculous." James opened his mouth to deliver a snarky retort, but his wire-rimmed glasses chose that exact microsecond to betray him, slipping free from the bridge of his nose. Because he was inverted, the spectacles began plummeting toward the turf below. James shot out a frantic hand to snatch them out of the air, but to his unadulterated surprise, Lily was infinitely quicker. Her hand darted into the empty space between them like a striking snitch. Before his fingers could even close, hers were already there, and for a breathless fragment of a second, the world came to a complete standstill. Their fingers touched, overlapping securely as they both clasped around the metal frames. James felt his stomach drop, a terrifying lurch echoing through his entire torso as if he had just entered a terminal 500-foot dive. It was a baffling sensation. He had been on a broom since he was a toddler. He knew for a fact that he wasn't afraid of heights, but looking at the pale skin of the hand locked against his, James realized with a jolt that this specific drop had absolutely nothing to do with the sky. Lily's expression morphed into one of mild irritation as she took the glasses out of his hand, leaving his vision a sudden blur of green and scarlet. "Did no one ever teach you about gravity, Potter?" James fluently flipped himself back upright, shifting his weight with a practiced ease even as his heart pounded a little too fast against his ribs. "Blimey," he thought, adjusting his grip on the school broom to hide the sudden tremor in his hands. Lily was clutching his spectacles, her vibrant red hair escaping its plait and bowling wildly in the blustery wind like fiery sparks. He shook his head, trying to snap out of the uncharacteristic daze before she noticed. She handed him the frames, and he hurriedly slid them over his ears, plastering an unbothered smirk back on his face to reclaim his territory. "Wizards don't need such intricacies like gravity," James proclaimed, pronouncing the word slowly and deliberately, as if it were something entirely forged and ridiculous. "All right, Evans, I come down with you, on one condition." Lily arched an eyebrow, her broom balancing perfectly against the gust. "And what's that?" "Join me for a spin?" She let out an exasperated huff, her shoulders dropping. "Stop acting like a child. Madame Hooch is waiting." "Black's gone, and I need a new racing partner," James pouted, deliberately widening his eyes with mock pleading. "Come on, Evans, just a quick dash," he thought, practically itching to see what she could do when she wasn't enforcing the rules. "However will I prove my flying skills now?" Lily gave a deeply skeptical look, completely unmoved by the theatrical display. "For real, Evans, I saw you before. You've got some serious speed." James pushed, a genuine spark of competitive excitement slipping into his tone. "You lack my formal technique, of course." "Oh, you're such a show-off." She reached out to shove his shoulders, but James's reflexes were far too quick. He easily dodged her hand, smoothly circling his broom around hers, with a grin that could only be described as unadulterated shit-eating. "Prove me wrong, then, unless you're too scared to lose." Without uttering another word, Lily swerved her broom around with an aggressive crack of the tail and chased right after him. James's booming laughter echoed across the open pitch as he zoomed out of her immediate reach, leaning flat over his handle. The ensuing competition quickly became brilliantly engaging, far more than James had ever anticipated. "Merlin, she's actually magnificent," he realized, his chest swelling with a dangerous amount of respect. Lily was faster than he'd expected for someone who didn't play, For just as he'd predicted, she liked his years of formal technique. He managed to beat her in 2 out of 3 frantic races between the golden goal paws, which made her scowl and scrunch up her nose every single time he pulled ahead using some high-speed aerial trick. Every time she made that brilliant, frustrated little face, James felt a terrifying little flip in his stomach, precisely like he was plunging down the highest drop of a mogul roller coaster. As they finally neared the home stretch toward the soggy turf, James was certain he had the final race in the bag. He could feel the thrill of victory vibrating in his bones. Every twist of his broomstick felt like second nature to him. But just as they began their final descent toward the landing zone, he slowed his pace down on purpose. He matched Lee's speed, cruising side by side as an intolerable grin chugged heavily at the corners of his mouth. This was all so easy. "It seems, Miss Evans," James said, pitching his voice into the most aristocratic tone he could muster, "that I've bested you in the fine art of flying. How about you teach me about that gravity thing before I claim my victory?" Lily turned her head toward him, a suspiciously radiant smile blooming on her lips. "You want to learn about gravity?" James, completely clueless to the magnificent mischief brewing in her mind, nodded eagerly, his guard down. "Yeah." She let out a melodic chuckle, the exact kind of dangerous sound that really should have set off every single tactical alarm bell inside James's brain. But before he could even think to react, Lily reached out and yanked his broom out from under him with a swift, beautifully calculated and utterly ruthless move. One moment he was hovering triumphantly beside her like the king of the castle, and the very next his center of gravity was obliterated. James went plummeting face first through the air, hurtling directly into the same swampy, muddy puddle that had claimed Sirius and Remus earlier. He hit the center of the bog with a loud, wet, spectacular splash, the thick mud splashing up around him in a brown wave. He immediately pushed himself up into his elbows, spluttering and spitting out a mouthful of dirty water, the gritty taste of earth clinging to his tongue. He yanked off his sludge-covered glasses to get a clear view of the world, or rather, the near-sighted mess that was his world without them. Through the haze, he could just make out Lily's elegant silhouette as she landed gracefully on the grass right in front of him, not a single hair out of place on her head. Behind her, the distant sound of the rest of the first years laughing uproariously echoed across the pitch. Even without the aid of his spectacles, James could clearly see the glowing smirk written across her face, the exact one that made his stomach do that terminal flipping thing all over again. "Let's call that lesson number 1 on gravity, Potter," she said, her tone dripping with unadulterated satisfaction. James sat in the thick of the mud, his face smeared with brown dirt and cold water dripping from his messy hair, but underneath the ruin of his kit, he was grinning like an idiot. Lily Evans had just bested him at his own game on his own turf, and Merlin, did he love it.